how should our military and intelligence leaders think about China? Obviously, there's the raw data, right? Just understanding the movements of their military and navy and all that good stuff. But how does China think about warfare? Do they even think that a hot war with the United States is a possibility?
Yeah, that's the big question. I would say the following. The flashpoint that is probably most acute militarily is in the South China Sea involving Taiwan's status and China's claims over Taiwan. As your audience is probably aware, China regards Taiwan as a breakaway province that will eventually reunite with the motherland. The United States takes a different view. The United States would like to preserve the freedom of Taiwan's people to choose their own destiny, and hopefully at some indeterminate point in the future for there to be a peaceful resolution of the status of Taiwan. Now, China, and particularly under Xi Jinping, has been very methodically laying down the groundwork brick by brick to create a military option that it could exercise at some point in the future. They're not quite there yet, but they very likely will be in the next 5 to 8 years, in which case if Xi Jinping woke up one morning and said, you know what, I'm going to go for it, he'll have all of the ingredients in place to do that. And so it's really incumbent on the United States to shore up the deterrence that we've preserved in that region really since the end of World War II regarding Taiwan. And we have that opportunity now if we step up really quickly. The ball in some senses in our court. You know, it's worth reflecting on the war in Ukraine after the Russians seized Crimea. And there was a period of time in which Europe and the United States could have mobilized to do much more to maintain deterrence in that region. But clearly deterrence failed, and Putin sensed that he had an opportunity to make a move on all of Ukraine, and he did. We face a similar opportunity right now to shore up deterrence in the region so that Xi Jinping says, you know what, there's sufficient uncertainty that even with all the hard work and money that I have spent building the military option, that I could prevail at acceptable cost in an acceptable time frame. And that's where we want to be. So we've got to invest hard because we are losing our edge right now in that region.
When you mentioned Taiwan, how do the people of Taiwan feel about China?
That's a great question. Taiwan's an incredibly vibrant, pluralistic democracy. It is, in a sense, one of the world's best success stories for a transition from a one-party authoritarian state into a socially progressive, economically liberal, vibrant, pluralistic electoral democracy. You couldn't do it any better than the way they did it peacefully. And that in and of itself is deeply threatening to the PRC because it demonstrates that there's nothing incompatible between Chinese culture and electoral liberal democracy. Taiwan has pulled it off and done it quite well. And if you look, they're executing brilliantly on high technology. So it's not even like they had to give up anything economically to achieve that. This is intolerable to a one-party authoritarian state like the CCP's regime in China. And the people of Taiwan generationally, because there's all this great public polling because it's a free society, there's a generational split in Taiwan in which older people will feel more of an ethnic Chinese identity and an affiliation with a greater Chinese population and a connection to the mainland and China and the PRC. A large segment of Taiwan's population fled the mainland in 1949 when the nationalist government collapsed. And they tended to be those who dominated political and cultural spaces for several decades thereafter in Taiwan. Their descendants, up until quite recently, still felt a connection to the mainland. But in the last 15 years or so, that's begun to shift just as a function of generational change. And people under 40 increasingly have a uniquely Taiwanese identity, where they'll say, yes, we are sort of ethnically Chinese and culturally Chinese, but we're not politically connected to the mainland, and we want to govern our own affairs, and we have this Taiwanese identity, and increasingly they use that word. They identify as Taiwanese, not Chinese. And that's critical because that means that the PRC, despite decades of trying to win hearts and minds, has actually lost ground, which means that really the only viable option it has for reunifying or absorbing Taiwan is coercive, because as time passes, the Taiwanese people feel no affinity towards the mainland.
You bring up an interesting perspective because if you look at just geographically, right, Taiwan's very close to China. They don't have far to go. Obviously, there's some issues with deep water vessels close to Taiwan. There's not much you can do there just based on the geography. You bring up an interesting question, which is the human geography. So I guess, will they invade Taiwan? Who knows? But my actual real question is, can they invade Taiwan? And what do they have to gain? Let's say they invade Taiwan, and then the people are like, yeah, we're not building these semiconductors for you. Sorry. Like, we don't belong here. Or they flee, they go to the Philippines, or they get out of Dodge. Like, what is there to gain from just, can coercion alone be enough to control a population to make them do what you want them to do?
Yeah, that is a great question. And for those who are thinking about military planning, contingency scenarios, and deterrence, the question of will to fight is especially strong. Again, we have the example of Ukraine, where I think many people thought that Ukraine would fall very quickly and that the Ukrainian military and people would not resist, and they would be foolish to resist a Russian juggernaut. And yet they were proven so very wrong by that. And so these are the kinds of things that are really difficult to answer. You don't know until, I suppose, a military and a people are tested. And to a large extent, Taiwan could not hold out by itself. It would be utterly reliant on the United States and the United States' allies and partners in that region to survive if the PRC decided to invade. And if it was clear that aid was not forthcoming, then the Taiwanese people might, in fact, choose not to resist. And that's not a position we want to put anyone in. We want to preserve their freedom of options, I suppose, and allow them to control their own destiny. But it's a David and Goliath story. You've got 1.4 billion people on one side and 24 odd million people on the other. The world's largest military on one side and a very small, relatively underfunded military that's falling behind technologically on the other. And so, yes, the PRC, if it wanted to, could take Taiwan in several years once it develops the amphibious landing capability. There potentially would be a high cost. And so it's really a question of would Xi Jinping be willing to bear that cost? Right. I will say rhetorically, he has made it very clear that it is his intention to absorb Taiwan. And in some sense, the PRC has been talking about this really for more than 70 years, that Taiwan is a last piece of unfinished business from the Chinese Civil War. But it's become more insistent, more real, more urgent under Xi Jinping.
So I want to just touch on this a little bit more. There's so many great topics to get to, but when I talk to military commanders in the Indo-PACOM region, their big focus is partnerships and these global partnerships. Who are our key partners in that region, and who kind of brings the most to the fight in regard to thwarting China's advances?
So you have to remember that the United States in that region does not have a NATO-like architecture in which it's sort of, all for one for all, but rather we have a series of bilateral relationships with nations in the region that are largely about preserving mutual defense bilaterally. So we have a U.S. mutual defense treaty, for example, with Japan. We have one with Korea. We have one with the Philippines. And so those are our bilateral allies, and they are not treaty bound to come to the defense of any particular other member. Their relationships are all sort of straight lines to the United States and not necessarily lateral. So it's a choice that they would have to make about whether they wanted to get involved in the fight. Now, having said that, the United States would be highly reliant on our infrastructure facilities in the Western Pacific, in particular Japan, and possibly also the Philippines, though we don't quite have what we used to have in the Philippines, in order to mount any assistance to Taiwan defense or intervention in a conflict. And so there is a question about the extent to which Japan would be willing to allow us to use our facilities to participate in a conflict at the risk of Japan being dragged into a war. Or on the other side, the extent to which Japan would actively participate as a combatant. And that's a choice a Japanese government would have to make. But the United States plus Japan as active combatants would be formidable because they have really complementary interoperable security architectures and orders of battle. And we've been exercising for a long time together. Right. A lot of people don't realize that actually the nearest Japanese island is, I think, about 80 miles away from Taiwan. So they have a front row seat if there's any conflict over Taiwan. And in fact, Japanese public opinion really shifted in the last few years, where in a series of military exercises after Speaker of the House Pelosi went to Taiwan and the PRC expressed its extreme displeasure by having military exercises around Taiwan and and firing missiles into the
Yeah,
ocean.
remember that.
Some of those missiles overflew Japanese territory and landed in Japanese waters. And that was a tipping, an inflection point in which the Japanese public said, we don't like that. And it really changed opinion on the extent to which China represents a threat to Japanese peace and security. But so those are the key partners. It's Japan and the Philippines in particular, but then it's also Australia and Korea. And we have to think that if there's a conflict between China and Taiwan, there's always the possibility that North Korea takes advantage of the fact that the U.S. is distracted and we're already involved in Ukraine, and then does something on the Korea border as well. So it's very easy for it to get big fast.
Okay.